The conference room fell silent as the audit team spread documents across the mahogany table. My former boss, Richard Thornfield, sat frozen in his leather chair, his face draining of color as the lead auditor opened the first folder. 3 months earlier, I'd been the senior operations manager of this very department. Now I was his son's assistant, relegated to fetching coffee and filing paperwork. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice, and today was about to be Richard's reckoning. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Jessica Martinez, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had found my dream job at Pinnacle Financial Solutions. The downtown Chicago office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper, and I'd worked my way up from junior analyst to senior operations manager over 5 grueling years. The salary was excellent, the benefits were comprehensive, and most importantly, I genuinely loved what I did. Richard Thornfield had been my boss for the past 2 years. A man in his late 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit collection, he projected the image of a successful executive. The company had been founded by his father 30 years ago, and Richard had inherited both the business and what seemed like an inflated sense of his own capabilities. Despite his shortcomings, I'd managed to maintain a professional relationship with him, mostly because I was good at my job and made him look competent by extension. The department I managed handled client portfolio analysis and risk assessment for high-net-worth individuals. We managed over $2 billion in assets, and our team of 12 analysts worked with surgical precision to ensure every investment decision was thoroughly vetted. I developed new protocols that had reduced our error rate by 60% and increased client satisfaction scores to an all-time high. The work was demanding, but seeing the tangible results of our efforts made every late night and weekend worth it. My daily routine involved reviewing overnight market reports, coordinating with our research team, and presenting findings to senior management. I'd arrive at the office by 7 each morning, armed with 3 cups of coffee and a detailed agenda for the day. The analyst respected my leadership style, which emphasized collaboration rather than micromanagement. We operated like a well-oiled machine, and even Richard's occasional interference couldn't derail our momentum. Everything changed on a Tuesday in March when Richard called me into his office for what he described as an important discussion about the future of the department. His office was a monument to corporate excess, with dark wood paneling, expensive artwork, and a view of Lake Michigan that cost the company more in rent than most people earned in a year. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, his expression unusually serious. "Jessica, I need to discuss some organizational changes that will be taking effect immediately," he began, shuffling through a stack of papers that I later realized were already signed and sealed. "The board has decided to restructure the operations department, and we're bringing in some fresh talent to help modernize our approach." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, but I maintained my professional composure. "What kind of restructuring are we talking about, Rich?" "Well, we're promoting someone to take over your current responsibilities, someone with innovative ideas and a fresh perspective on portfolio management." He paused, clearly savoring the moment. "My son Marcus will be joining us as the new senior operations manager, effective immediately." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Marcus Thornfield was 26 years old with an MBA from a mid-tier university, and exactly 18 months of experience at a small investment firm in Milwaukee. I'd met him twice at company holiday parties, and both times he'd spent more time discussing his golf handicap than anything related to finance. The idea of him managing a $2 billion portfolio was not just absurd, it was potentially catastrophic. "I see," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the earthquake occurring in my chest. "And what role would I be transitioning to?" Richard's smile was probably meant to be reassuring, but it came across as condescending. "You'll be working directly with Marcus as his executive assistant. Your experience will be invaluable in helping him get up to speed, and you'll still be involved in the day-to-day operations of the department." Executive assistant. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. 5 years of 60-hour weeks, countless successful projects, and industry recognition, all reduced to scheduling meetings and organizing files. I'd gone from managing a team of 12 to fetching coffee for someone who couldn't distinguish between a put option and a call option. This is quite a significant change, I said, choosing my words carefully. Have you discussed this transition timeline with the team? Marcus starts Monday. I'll be announcing the changes to the department this afternoon. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with his decision. I know this might seem like a step backward, Jessica, but sometimes we need to make room for the next generation of leadership. Marcus has some really innovative ideas about algorithmic trading and social media marketing that could revolutionize our approach. Algorithmic trade, social media marketing. For a department that managed conservative portfolios for retirees and institutional clients, the absurdity of the situation was almost laughable, except that it was happening to me. I understand, I replied, standing up from my chair. I'll need some time to process this information and prepare for the transition. Of course, take all the time you need. Marcus is really excited to work with you. I walked out of Richard's office in a daze, my mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. My first instinct was to march straight to human resources and file a complaint, but I knew that would be futile. Richard's father still held significant influence over company policy, and challenging a Thornfield family decision was tantamount to career suicide. The announcement that afternoon was even more humiliating than I'd anticipated. Richard gathered the entire department in the main conference room, his chest puffed out with pride as he introduced his son as our new leader. Marcus wore a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his confident smile suggested he believed he'd earned this promotion through merit rather than genetics. I'm really excited to bring some fresh energy to this team, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to prove yourself. I have some revolutionary ideas about incorporating cryptocurrency analysis into our portfolio strategies, and I think we can really leverage social media analytics to predict market trends. I watched my former team exchange glances of confusion and concern. These were seasoned professionals who understood that cryptocurrency had no place in conservative portfolio management, and the idea of using social media to predict market movements was the kind of strategy that belonged in a freshman economics textbook, not a professional investment firm. Sarah Chen, one of our senior analysts, raised her hand tentatively. Marcus, could you elaborate on how social media analytics would apply to our current client base? Most of our portfolios are focused on long-term stability rather than trend-based investments. Marcus's smile faltered slightly. Well, Sarah, I think you'll find that modern investment strategies require a more dynamic approach. We can't just rely on traditional metrics when we have access to real-time sentiment analysis. The room fell silent. Sarah had been managing institutional portfolios for over a decade, and her questioning wasn't meant to be confrontational. She was simply trying to understand how Marcus's ideas would apply to the actual work we did. His response revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of our department's function. I'm sure Jessica can help explain some of the operational details, Marcus continued, gesturing toward me with a casual wave. She'll be working as my assistant, so she'll be able to provide context on how we've been doing things. Assistant. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several of my former team members looked at me with expressions of shock and sympathy. They understood exactly what had happened, and they knew that it had nothing to do with my performance or capabilities. After the meeting, I returned to my office to begin the soul-crushing process of boxing up my belongings. The space that had been my professional sanctuary for 3 years would soon be occupied by someone else, while I moved to a small desk outside Marcus's office. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be sitting in the same area where the previous executive assistants had worked, watching the department I'd built from the outside. My phone buzzed with a text message from David Kim, our risk assessment specialist. Coffee after work. We need to talk. 3 hours later, I sat in a small cafe near the office with David and 2 other team members, Rebecca Walsh and Thomas Anderson. The conversation was a mixture of outrage, concern, and strategic planning. They were worried about the future of the department under Marcus's leadership, and they wanted to know if I had any plans to fight the demotion. This is completely insane, Rebecca said, stirring her latte with unnecessary force. You've been the backbone of this department for years. Without you, we'd never have implemented the new risk protocols or landed the Henderson account. Thomas nodded in agreement. Marcus spent 15 minutes in our team meeting talking about using Twitter sentiment to predict bond yields. I'm not sure he understands what bonds are. David leaned forward, his expression serious. Jessica, what are you going to do? You can't just accept this. I'd been asking myself the same question all afternoon. The practical part of my mind knew that finding a new job would be the smart move, but the idea of abandoning my team and letting Marcus destroy everything we'd built felt like cowardice. There was also the matter of pride, and the desire to prove that merit should matter more than nepotism. I'm going to stay, I said finally. At least for now, I want to see how this plays out. Are you serious? Rebecca looked at me like I'd announced my intention to join a cult. You're going to be his assistant, Jessica. You'll be scheduling his meetings and making his coffee. Maybe, I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. But I'll also be in a position to observe everything he does. And if he's as incompetent as we think he is, someone's going to notice eventually. The next few weeks were a masterclass in professional humiliation. Marcus moved into my old office and immediately began redecorating, replacing my industry awards and professional certifications with abstract art and a pudding green. He purchased a standing desk, a massage chair, and a coffee machine that cost more than most people's monthly car payment. My new workspace was a small desk in the reception area outside his office, equipped with a basic computer and a phone that seemed to ring constantly. Marcus had decided that all departmental communication should flow through his assistant, which meant that I spent most of my day scheduling meetings, taking messages and explaining to confused clients why their regular point of contact was no longer available. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The work was mind-numbing, but it also provided me with a unique perspective on Marcus's decision-making process. I attended every meeting, took notes on every call, and maintained his calendar with military precision. What I discovered was even worse than I'd anticipated. Marcus's innovative strategies were a collection of half-baked ideas cobbled together from investment blogs and social media posts. His morning routine involved spending 2 hours reading financial Twitter and Reddit forums, then presenting random theories to the team as if they were groundbreaking insights. He'd instituted daily innovation meetings where he would ramble about cryptocurrency while the analysts sat in stunned silence. The Henderson account, which had been our department's crown jewel, was showing signs of strain. Henderson, a 72-year-old widow with a conservative investment philosophy, had called 3 times in the past week, expressing concern about the experimental approaches being suggested for her portfolio. Marcus had proposed allocating 15% of her retirement funds to a cryptocurrency index fund, apparently unaware that such a strategy violated both her risk tolerance and the company's fiduciary responsibility. I watched in fascination and horror as Marcus systematically dismantled every protocol I'd spent years developing. The morning briefings, which had been focused and informative, became rambling monologues about market trends he'd read about on social media. The risk assessment reports, which had been comprehensive and data-driven, were reduced to simple spreadsheets that ignored crucial variables. Most troubling of all, Marcus had begun making investment decisions without proper documentation or approval. He'd moved client funds between accounts based on gut feelings and market intuition, creating a paper trail that would have given our compliance officer nightmares if she'd known about it. But she didn't know about it, because Marcus had also decided that compliance reviews were bureaucratic obstacles to innovation. He'd instructed the team to streamline their reporting, which essentially meant skipping the safeguards that prevented exactly the kind of reckless behavior he was now exhibiting. As his assistant, I was privy to all of this information. I typed his emails, scheduled his meetings, and maintained his files. I knew about every unauthorized transaction, every ignored protocol, and every client complaint that he'd dismissed as resistance to change. The scope of his incompetence was staggering, and I found myself in the unique position of being the only person who could see the full picture. 3 weeks into my new role, I was organizing Marcus's office files when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in a folder marked Personal Projects, I found evidence of transactions that weren't just unauthorized, they were potentially illegal. Marcus had been using client funds to cover losses in his personal trading account, apparently believing that he could replace the money before anyone noticed. The amounts were relatively small, ranging from $5,000 to $20,000 per transaction, but the pattern was clear. Marcus would borrow money from client accounts to fund his personal investments, then use profits from those investments to cover the borrowing. When his personal trades lost money, he would simply borrow more from other accounts, creating a complex web of unauthorized transfers that would be impossible to track without detailed analysis. I sat in the empty office, staring at the documents in my hands, trying to process what I'd discovered. This wasn't just incompetence anymore, it was fraud. Marcus was stealing from clients, including elderly retirees who trusted the company with their life savings. The scope of the theft was still relatively small, but the pattern suggested it would only get worse as Marcus became more desperate to cover his losses. My first instinct was to report the discovery immediately, but I knew that doing so would raise questions about how I'd obtained access to the information. Marcus could claim that I'd been snooping through his personal files, and given my recent demotion, it would be easy to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. I needed more evidence, and I needed to document everything carefully before making any move. Over the next several days, I began systematically copying every document, email, and transaction record I could access. As Marcus's assistant, I had legitimate reasons to be in his office and handling his files, so I was able to gather evidence without raising suspicion. The picture that emerged was even more damning than I'd initially realized. Marcus wasn't just stealing from clients, he was also manipulating reporting data to hide his unauthorized activity. He'd been submitting false performance reports to senior management, claiming credit for gains that had actually come from my former team's work while concealing the losses from his personal trading disaster. The web of deception was so complex that it would take a team of forensic accountants to unravel completely. Meanwhile, the department continued to deteriorate under Marcus's leadership. 3 of our longest-standing clients had moved their accounts to other firms, citing concerns about recent changes in management approach. The remaining clients were growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of communication and the erratic performance of their portfolio. Sarah Chen approached me one afternoon, her expression grave. "Jessica, we need to talk. Something's wrong with the Morrison account." The Morrison account was a $50 million institutional portfolio that required careful management and regular reporting. Sarah had been trying to reconcile the quarterly statements when she'd discovered discrepancies that didn't make sense. "There are transactions here that I didn't authorize," she said, showing me a printout of the account activity. "Someone's been moving money around and I can't figure out why." I looked at the documents, my heart sinking as I recognized the pattern. Marcus had been using the Morrison account as his personal piggy bank, borrowing funds to cover losses in other accounts. The transactions were disguised as routine rebalancing activities, but the timing and amounts matched exactly with his personal trading losses. "I need to do some research," I told Sarah. "Can you give me a few days to look into this?" "Jessica, if there's something wrong with this account, I need to report it immediately. The Morrison Foundation depends on this money for their charitable operation." I understood her concern, but I also knew that a premature report could give Marcus time to cover his tracks or blame someone else for the discrepancies. "Give me until Friday," I said. "I think I know what's happening, but I need to be absolutely certain before we take any action." That evening, I stayed late in the office, using my access to Marcus's computer to dig deeper into the unauthorized transactions. What I found was a systematic pattern of theft that stretched back to his first week on the job. He'd been stealing from clients from day one, apparently believing that his family name would protect him from any consequences. The total amount of the theft was approaching $200,000, spread across dozens of accounts. Marcus had been particularly targeting elderly clients and institutional accounts, apparently believing that they were less likely to notice small discrepancies in their statement. The audacity of his actions was breathtaking, but the real shock came when I realized that he'd been falsifying documents to cover his tracks. I'd discovered the smoking gun, but I also knew that I was sitting on a powder keg. Marcus's theft wasn't just a crime, it was the kind of scandal that could destroy the entire company. Pinnacle Financial Solutions had built its reputation on trust and integrity, and the revelation that the boss's son had been stealing from clients would be front-page news in every financial publication in the country. As I sat in the darkened office, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's crimes, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could report what I'd found and hope that justice would prevail, or I could continue gathering evidence and wait for the perfect moment to expose everything. The choice I made would determine not just my own future, but the fate of everyone who worked at Pinnacle Financial Solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had demoted me to the perfect position to discover his crime. As his assistant, I had access to information that no one else could see, and I was invisible enough that he'd never suspected I was watching his every move. Richard had thought he was humiliating me by making me his son's assistant, but he'd actually put me in the ideal position to bring down his entire family. Friday morning arrived with the weight of decision hanging over me like a storm cloud. I'd spent the week documenting every aspect of Marcus's fraud, creating a comprehensive file that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that timing would be everything if I wanted to ensure that justice was served. As I prepared to make the most important decision of my career, I couldn't help but think about the twisted path that had led me to this moment. 3 months ago, I'd been a respected manager with a promising future. Now I was an assistant with the power to expose a massive fraud and potentially save the company from scandal. Sometimes the universe has a strange way of putting you exactly where you need to be, even when it doesn't feel like it at the time. I made my decision on a rainy Friday morning in April. The office was unusually quiet, with most employees working from home due to a citywide transportation strike. Marcus had called in sick, claiming he had food poisoning from an expensive sushi restaurant, which gave me unrestricted access to his computer and files for the entire day. Instead of reporting the fraud immediately, I chose a different strategy. I would let Marcus dig his own grave deeper while I prepared an ironclad case that would be impossible to dismiss. The key was patience and meticulous documentation. I spent the morning creating encrypted backups of every incriminating document, storing them on multiple secure drives hidden in different locations. By noon, I had compiled a comprehensive portfolio of Marcus's criminal activity. The evidence included unauthorized transaction records, falsified performance reports, manipulated client statements, and email communications that clearly showed his intent to deceive. Most damning of all were the bank records from his personal account, which showed a direct correlation between his trading losses and the mysterious adjustments in client portfolios. But I needed more than just documentation. I needed witnesses and independent verification that couldn't be dismissed as the vindictive actions of a demoted employee. That's when I remembered something crucial. Pinnacle Financial Solutions was scheduled for its annual regulatory audit in 6 weeks. The audit would be conducted by an independent firm with no loyalty to the Thornfield family, and they would examine every aspect of our operations with forensic precision. The plan that formed in my mind was elegant in its simplicity. I would continue working as Marcus's assistant, giving him enough rope to hang himself while ensuring that all of his fraudulent activities would be perfectly preserved for the auditors to discover. When the audit team arrived, they would find a treasure trove of evidence that would expose not just Marcus's crimes, but Richard's negligent management and the systemic failures that had allowed the fraud to occur. Over the following weeks, I became the perfect assistant. I scheduled Marcus's meetings with military precision, organized his files with obsessive attention to detail, and maintained his calendar with the dedication of a Swiss watchmaker. What Marcus didn't realize was that every organized file was a piece of evidence, every scheduled meeting was a potential witness, and every calendar entry was a timestamp that would later be used to establish a timeline of his criminal activity. Marcus, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly reckless. His early success in covering up his unauthorized transactions had given him a false sense of security, and he began taking bigger risks with larger amounts of money. The Morrison Foundation account, which had started as a source of small loans, became his personal ATM machine. He was now borrowing $50,000 at a time, using the money to fund increasingly desperate attempts to recover his loss. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus decided to invest $200,000 of client funds in a cryptocurrency scheme promoted by a social media influencer. The investment was not just unauthorized and inappropriate for our client base, it was also a blatant violation of federal securities regulation. The cryptocurrency in question was a newly launched token called Mooncoin, which promised astronomical returns, but had no underlying value or legitimate business model. I watched in fascination as Marcus transferred the money from 3 different elderly clients' accounts, apparently believing that he could triple the investment and return the funds before anyone noticed. The hubris was staggering, but it was also the final piece of evidence I needed to ensure his complete downfall. The Mooncoin investment collapsed within 2 weeks, taking the entire $200,000 with it. Marcus spent 3 days in a state of barely concealed panic, frantically trying to find ways to cover the massive loss. He considered borrowing money from his father, taking out a personal loan, or even selling his luxury car, but none of these options would generate enough money to replace what he'd stolen. That's when Marcus made his most catastrophic decision. Instead of confessing his crimes or seeking help, he decided to double down on his fraud. He began systematically looting every account he could access, stealing money from retirement funds, college savings plans, and charitable endowment. The scope of his theft expanded from $200,000 to over $500,000 in a matter of days. I documented every transaction, every forged signature, and every falsified report. Marcus had become so desperate that he was no longer trying to be subtle about his crime. He was stealing money in broad daylight, apparently believing that his family name would protect him from any consequences. The evidence I was collecting was so overwhelming that it would be impossible for anyone to claim ignorance or plausible deniability. Meanwhile, the collateral damage from Marcus's leadership was becoming impossible to ignore. The department's client retention rate had dropped to 60%, the lowest in company history. Our average portfolio performance had declined by 15%, wiping out millions of dollars in client wealth. 3 senior analysts had submitted resignation letters, citing concerns about ethical violations and unprofessional management practices. Sarah Chen was the first to crack under the pressure. She approached me one afternoon, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Jessica, I can't keep covering for him. The Morrison account is completely scrambled, and I can't make sense of the transaction. If the foundation discovers what's happening, they'll sue us into bankruptcy." I looked at Sarah, seeing the moral dilemma written across her face. She was a consummate professional who had built her career on integrity and competence. Watching Marcus destroy everything she'd worked for was torture, but she also understood the potential consequences of speaking out against the boss's son. "What do you think we should do?" I asked, knowing that I needed to be careful about how much I revealed. "I think we need to report this to Richard immediately," Sarah said. "Maybe he doesn't know what's happening, and he can put a stop to it before it gets worse." I almost laughed at the naivety of her suggestion. Richard knew exactly what was happening, but he was too invested in his son's success to acknowledge the reality of the situation. He'd been receiving weekly reports about the department's declining performance, but he'd been dismissing them as growing pains and resistance to change. "I'm not sure that's the best approach," I said carefully. "Richard is very invested in Marcus's success. He might not be receptive to criticism, especially from employees, who he might see as undermining his son's authority." Sarah looked at me with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "Then what do you suggest? We can't just sit here and watch him destroy the entire department." "The audit is in 3 weeks," I said. "Maybe we should wait and see what the auditors find. If there are real problems, they'll discover them independently, and we won't be in the position of making accusations against management." It was a calculated risk, but I needed Sarah to stay quiet for just a few more weeks. If she reported her concerns to Richard prematurely, it might give Marcus time to cover his tracks, or find someone else to blame for the missing money. The audit was my ace in the hole, and I couldn't afford to have it compromised by premature revelation. Sarah agreed to wait, but I could see that the stress was taking a toll on her. She'd started working late every night, trying to clean up the mess that Marcus was creating during the day. Her meticulous nature made her the perfect witness to his crimes, but it also meant that she was suffering personally from having to enable his fraud. Thomas Anderson and Rebecca Walsh were dealing with their own moral crises. Thomas had discovered that Marcus had been forging his signature on risk assessment reports, using his credentials to authorize investments that violated every principle of conservative portfolio management. Rebecca had found evidence that Marcus was manipulating client statements to hide losses, creating fictional gains that made his performance appear better than it actually was. The three of them formed an informal support group, meeting for coffee after work to discuss their concerns and debate their options. I was occasionally invited to these meetings, where I played the role of the sympathetic former manager who was just as frustrated as they were. What they didn't know was that I was using these conversations to gather additional evidence and ensure that their testimonies would be preserved for the audit. 2 weeks before the audit, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been reviewing his personal trading account when he realized that one of his unauthorized transactions had been flagged by the company's automated monitoring system. The flag hadn't triggered any immediate action, but it had created a record that would be easily discovered during the audit. Marcus spent the weekend in a state of panic, trying to figure out how to delete or modify the flagged transaction. He didn't understand that the monitoring system was designed to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation, and his attempts to cover his tracks only created more evidence of his criminal intent. On Monday morning, Marcus called me into his office, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Jessica, I need you to help me with something. There's been a mistake in the system, and I need to correct some transaction records before the audit next week." I maintained my expression of professional concern while my heart raced with excitement. Marcus was about to ask me to help him commit fraud, which would make me a direct witness to his criminal intent. "What kind of mistake?" I asked. "There are some transactions that got coded incorrectly," Marcus said, his voice lacking conviction. "The system flagged them as unauthorized, but they were actually legitimate rebalancing activities. I need you to help me correct the coding so the auditors don't get confused." I pretended to consider his request while internally marveling at his stupidity. He was asking me to help him falsify records that would be reviewed by professional auditors within days. The evidence of his criminal intent couldn't be more clear if he'd written a confession. "I'm not sure I have the technical expertise to modify transaction codes," I said carefully. "Wouldn't it be better to have the IT department handle this kind of correction?" Marcus's face flushed with anger. "No, absolutely not. This is a minor administrative issue that we can handle internally. I don't want to involve IT because they might ask too many questions." There it was. Marcus had just explicitly stated that he wanted to avoid scrutiny from other departments, which any reasonable person would interpret as evidence of fraudulent intent. I was now a direct witness to his attempt to cover up his crimes, and his statements would be impossible to dismiss as misunderstandings or honest mistakes. "Of course," I said, adopting the tone of a loyal assistant. "I'll do whatever you need to help resolve this issue." Marcus spent the next 2 hours walking me through the transactions he wanted to modify, explaining in detail how each one should be recoded to avoid detection during the audit. He was essentially providing me with a comprehensive tutorial on how he'd been stealing from clients, complete with specific amounts, dates and methods. The level of detail was so extensive that it would be impossible for him to later claim that he'd been misunderstood or taken out of context. I took careful notes throughout the conversation, occasionally asking clarifying questions that prompted Marcus to provide even more incriminating information. By the end of the meeting, I had a complete confession of his crimes, recorded in his own words and witnessed by his own request. That evening, I made copies of every document, email and recording I'd collected over the past 2 months. The evidence now filled 3 large binders and several encrypted drives, creating a comprehensive record of Marcus's fraud that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The scope of his crimes was staggering: over $800,000 stolen from more than 40 client accounts, falsified reports submitted to senior management, forged signatures on official documents, and systematic violations of federal securities regulation. The audit was scheduled to begin on Monday morning, The team from Crawford and Associates was known for their thoroughness and independence, and they had a reputation for uncovering fraud that other firms had missed. Their lead auditor, Patricia Rawlings, was a former federal prosecutor who had spent 15 years investigating white-collar crime before joining the accounting firm. I spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be the most important week of my career. The evidence I'd collected was comprehensive and damning, but I needed to ensure that it would be discovered by the auditors in a way that appeared natural and inevitable. The key was to make sure that Marcus's crimes were exposed through the normal audit process, rather than appearing to be the result of a vindictive employee's accusations. Sunday night, I received a text message from David Kim, "Coffee tomorrow before the audit. I think we need to discuss what's been happening in the department." I agreed to meet him, knowing that his concerns would provide the perfect opportunity to guide the auditors toward the evidence they needed to find. The next morning would mark the beginning of Marcus's downfall, and I wanted to make sure that every detail was perfect. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, I'd been humiliated by a demotion that seemed to end my career prospects. Now I was in position to expose a massive fraud and potentially save the company from scandal. The irony was delicious, but the stakes were too high for me to take any satisfaction in personal revenge. Tomorrow would be Judgment Day, and I was ready to watch Marcus's world come crashing down around him. The audit would expose not just his hes, but the systematic failures that had allowed them to occur. Richard's negligent management, the company's inadequate oversight, and the culture of nepotism that had enabled Marcus's fraud would all be laid bare for the world to see. Justice was coming, and I had the front row seat to watch it unfold. The Crawford and Associates audit team arrived at 8:30 a.m. sharp, their black sedans pulling up to the building's main entrance like a convoy of doom. Patricia Rawlings emerged from the lead vehicle, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression radiating the kind of professional intensity that comes from decades of exposing financial fraud. She was accompanied by 3 junior auditors, each carrying briefcases and laptops that would soon become instruments of Marcus's destruction. I watched from the reception area as Richard personally greeted the audit team, his usual confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy. He'd spent the weekend coaching Marcus on how to handle the audit questions, apparently believing that proper presentation could somehow mask the underlying criminal activity. The irony was that Richard's coaching had only made Marcus more nervous, and his anxiety was visible from across the lobby. "Good morning, everyone," Patricia announced as the team gathered in the main conference room. "We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of your operations over the next 3 days. We appreciate your cooperation and look forward to a productive examination." Marcus fidgeted in his chair, his expensive suit, unable to hide the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He'd arrived at the office an hour early, frantically reviewing the files he'd asked me to help him modify. What he didn't know was that I had deliberately avoided making any changes to the flagged transactions, ensuring that the auditors would discover them exactly as they appeared in the original records. The first day of the audit proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. The team divided into pairs, with each pair focusing on different aspects of the department's operations. Patricia herself took charge of reviewing the transaction records, while her junior associates examined client files and performance reports. I maintained my role as Marcus's assistant, providing the auditors with requested documents while carefully observing their reactions. By noon, Patricia had discovered the first red flag. She'd been reviewing the Morrison Foundation account when she noticed unusual patterns in the transaction timing. The movements of funds didn't correspond to any legitimate investment strategy, and the amounts were suspiciously round numbers that suggested manual manipulation rather than algorithmic trading. "Miss Thornfield," Patricia called to Marcus, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years interrogating white-collar criminals. "Could you explain the rationale behind these transactions in the Morrison account?" Marcus's face went pale as he approached Patricia's workstation. I watched from my desk as he stammered through an explanation about dynamic rebalancing strategies and opportunistic market positioning. His words were meaningless financial jargon strung together without any coherent logic, and Patricia's expression made it clear that she recognized the evasion for what it was. "I see," Patricia said, making notes on her legal pad. And who authorized these specific transactions? I did, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the senior operations manager, I have discretionary authority over portfolio adjustments. Of course, Patricia nodded. I'll need to see the authorization documents and risk assessment reports for these transactions. I watched Marcus's face crumble as he realized that he'd never created proper documentation for his unauthorized trades. The transactions had been executed through his personal access codes, but there were no formal approvals, no risk assessments, and no client notification. He was trapped by his own negligence, and Patricia's systematic approach was exposing every gap in his fraudulent scheme. I'll need to gather those documents, Marcus said, his voice shaking. They might be in my office files. That's fine, Patricia replied. We'll wait while you retrieve them. Marcus spent the next hour frantically searching through his office, pulling out files and documents in a desperate attempt to find something that would justify his action. I sat at my desk, occasionally glancing up to see him rifling through cabinets and drawers, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as he realized that no such documentation existed. Meanwhile, Patricia had moved on to examining other accounts, and her discoveries were accelerating. She'd found the cryptocurrency investment that had cost $200,000, the forged signatures on risk assessment reports, and the manipulated client statements that had hidden millions in losses. Each discovery was methodically documented, photographed, and cross-referenced with other evidence. By 3 p.m., Patricia had requested a private meeting with Richard. I watched through the glass walls of the conference room as she spread documents across the table, her expression grave as she explained her preliminary finding. Richard's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a sick realization that his son's incompetence had crossed the line into criminal behavior. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Richard emerged looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Patricia followed him out, her professional composure intact but her expression suggesting that she'd delivered devastating news. She approached Marcus's office, knocked on the door, and requested another private conversation. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Marcus's body language through the glass. His shoulders slumped, his hands trembled, and his face went completely white as Patricia presented her evidence. She was showing him bank records, transaction logs, and client statements that proved beyond any doubt that he'd been systematically stealing from accounts under his management. 20 minutes later, Marcus emerged from his office, his face streaked with tears and his expensive suit wrinkled from nervous perspiration. He walked directly to his father's office without making eye contact with anyone, his confidence and arrogance completely shattered. The confrontation between father and son was audible throughout the entire floor. Richard's voice, normally controlled and measured, rose to a roar as he demanded explanations for the evidence Patricia had presented. Marcus's responses were incoherent sobs punctuated by desperate attempts to justify his actions. The argument lasted 30 minutes before descending into silence, broken only by the sound of Richard's office door slamming shut. At 5 p.m., Patricia called an emergency meeting with the entire department. Her expression was professional but grim as she addressed the assembled staff. We've discovered significant irregularities in several client accounts that require immediate attention. Effective immediately, all trading activities in this department are suspended pending further investigation. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively. Are you saying that we're being shut down? I'm saying that we've found evidence of unauthorized transactions and possible fraud, Patricia replied. The scope of the investigation will determine what additional actions are necessary. David Kim looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of shock and understanding. He'd suspected that something was wrong, but the confirmation that his fears were justified was clearly devastating. Rebecca Walsh and Thomas Anderson exchanged glances, both realizing that their concerns about Marcus's management had been more serious than they'd imagined. What happens to our clients? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. All client accounts will be frozen until we can determine the extent of the irregularities, Patricia explained. We're working with federal regulators to ensure that client funds are protected and that any losses are properly addressed. The meeting ended with instructions for all staff to preserve their work materials and cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation. As the room emptied, I remained at my desk, watching the chaos unfold around me. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, and the results exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Marcus didn't return to his office that evening. According to office gossip, he'd left the building through the parking garage, avoiding the main lobby where employees might see him. His father remained locked in his office, presumably making phone calls to lawyers and crisis management consultants. The next morning brought a parade of federal investigators, SEC officials, and FBI agents. The building's lobby looked like a crime scene, with serious-looking people in dark suits carrying boxes of evidence and interviewing employees. The local news media had somehow learned about the investigation, and camera crews were stationed outside the building, hoping to capture footage of the disgraced executives. I arrived at work to find my desk cordoned off with yellow tape. Patricia approached me with a gentle smile, her demeanor much warmer than it had been during the formal audit proceedings. "Ms. Martinez, I understand you've been working as Mr. Thornfield's assistant for the past few months." "That's correct," I replied, maintaining my professional composure despite the excitement I felt at seeing justice finally being served. "We're going to need to interview you extensively about your observations during that time," Patricia continued. "Your position gave you unique access to information that will be crucial to our investigation." Over the next 6 hours, I provided Patricia and her team with a detailed account of everything I'd witnessed during my time as Marcus's assistant. I described his reckless decision-making, his unauthorized transactions, his attempts to cover up his crimes, and his explicit request for me to help him falsify records. My testimony was corroborated by the extensive documentation I'd maintained, creating an airtight case that would be impossible to dispute. The investigation revealed that Marcus had stolen over $1.2 million from 47 different client accounts. The scope of his fraud was staggering, encompassing not just unauthorized trades, but also identity theft, document forgery, and money laundering. The cryptocurrency investment alone had cost clients $400,000, money that was completely unrecoverable due to the collapse of the fraudulent scheme. But the real bombshell came when investigators discovered that Richard had been aware of at least some of his son's activity. Email records showed that several clients had complained directly to Richard about suspicious transactions, and he dismissed their concerns without conducting any investigation. His negligence had enabled Marcus's crimes to continue and escalate, making him legally liable as both a supervisor and a company officer. The fallout was swift and devastating. Marcus was arrested on federal charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and investment advisor fraud. His bail was set at $2 million, which Richard had to secure by mortgaging his personal assets. The company's stock price plummeted by 60% as news of the fraud spread through financial media. Richard resigned in disgrace, his 30-year career ending in scandal and potential criminal liability. The SEC imposed massive fines on the company, and several major clients filed lawsuits seeking damages for their losses. The department I'd spent 5 years building was disbanded, with the remaining staff transferred to other divisions or laid off entirely. As for me, I found myself in an unexpectedly powerful position. The investigation had revealed that I was the only person who'd maintained proper documentation of Marcus's activities, and my testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. Patricia recommended me for a position with Crawford & Associates, recognizing that my analytical skills and attention to detail would be valuable assets in forensic accounting. 6 months later, I was working as a senior forensic accountant, helping other companies investigate financial fraud and implement proper oversight procedures. The irony wasn't lost on me that Richard's attempt to humiliate me had actually advanced my career in ways I never could have imagined. Marcus was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution. Richard received a 3-year sentence for his role in enabling the fraud, though he was allowed to serve his time in a minimum security facility. The company was acquired by a larger firm, and the Thornfield family name disappeared from the financial services industry forever. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it's often more complete than anyone could have anticipated. My demotion from manager to assistant had seemed like the end of my career. But it was actually the beginning of something much more important, the exposure of a massive fraud that had victimized dozens of innocent people. The universe has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people enough rope to hang themselves. 2 years had passed since the Pinnacle financial scandal rocked the Chicago investment community, and I was sitting in the boardroom of Meridian Capital, one of the city's most prestigious financial firms. The mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. I was no longer the demoted assistant or even the forensic accountant who'd helped expose corporate fraud. I was Jessica Martinez, senior partner at Crawford & Associates, and I was about to deliver the most important presentation of my career. The Meridian executives listened intently as I outlined our findings from a 6-month investigation into their competitor Apex Investment. What we'd discovered was a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that made Marcus Thornfield's amateur hour fraud look like petty theft. The scheme involved over $50 million in client funds and had been operating for nearly 5 years under the direction of Apex's charismatic CEO Jonathan Sterling. The pattern is remarkably similar to what we uncovered at Pinnacle, I explained, clicking through slides that detailed unauthorized transfers, falsified statements, and phantom investment returns. Sterling has been using new investor funds to pay returns to existing clients, creating the illusion of consistent profits, while systematically looting the underlying capital. Patricia Rawlings, now my business partner and closest friend, nodded approvingly from across the table. The success of our Pinnacle investigation had launched Crawford & Associates into the top tier of forensic accounting firms, and we'd become the go-to team for uncovering financial fraud in the Midwest. Our reputation was built on meticulous investigation, unshakable integrity, and a talent for explaining complex financial crimes in terms that judges and juries could understand. "How confident are you in these findings?" asked Victoria Chen, Meridian's chief risk officer and Sarah Chen's younger sister. The financial world was surprisingly small, and connections from my previous life occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. "Completely confident," I replied. "We have documentation of every fraudulent transaction, recorded phone conversations where Sterling admits to manipulating client accounts, and testimony from 3 former employees who witnessed the scheme firsthand. The evidence is overwhelming." The Meridian executives exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of our investigation. Sterling's firm had been aggressively poaching their clients with promises of unrealistic returns, and many in the industry had suspected that something wasn't quite right. Our investigation had confirmed their suspicions and provided them with the ammunition they needed to protect their business. After the presentation, Victoria approached me privately. "Jessica, I wanted to thank you personally for this work. My sister Sarah speaks very highly of you, and she's told me about what happened at Pinnacle. I'm glad to see that justice was served." Sarah had landed on her feet after the Pinnacle collapse, finding a position at a boutique investment firm where her skills were properly appreciated. We'd maintained our friendship over the years, and she'd become one of my strongest professional references. The network of relationships I'd built during my time in operations had proven invaluable in my new career as an investigator. "Sarah was instrumental in exposing Marcus's fraud," I replied. "Her attention to detail and moral courage made all the difference in building our case." That evening, I returned to my Lincoln Park apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom unit with exposed brick walls and a view of the Chicago skyline. The contrast with my life 2 years earlier was striking. I'd gone from being humiliated in a corporate office to building a successful consulting practice that allowed me to work on cases that genuinely matter. The financial rewards were substantial, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that my work was protecting innocent investors from predatory schemes. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Jessica, this is David Kim. I hope you remember me from Pinnacle. I have something important to discuss with you. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" David had been one of the analysts who'd suffered most during the Pinnacle scandal. Despite having no involvement in Marcus's fraud, he'd struggled to find new employment due to the stigma associated with the company's collapse. I'd provided references for him whenever possible, but the financial industry had a long memory for scandal, and innocent employees often paid the price for their executives' crimes. We met the next morning at a small cafe in the Loop, the same neighborhood where Pinnacle's offices had once stood. David looked older and more tired than I remembered, the stress of unemployment and professional uncertainty having taken its toll. But there was also a determined glint in his eyes that suggested he had something important to share. "Jessica, I need to tell you about something that's been bothering me for months," David began, his voice low and urgent. "I've been working part-time for a small investment firm called Heritage Portfolio Management, and I think they might be involved in something similar to what Marcus was doing." My investigative instincts immediately sharpened. Heritage was a mid-sized firm that specialized in managing retirement accounts for middle-class clients. They'd built their reputation on conservative investment strategies and personal attention, exactly the kind of firm that elderly investors trusted with their life savings. "What kind of irregularities are you seeing?" I asked, pulling out my phone to take notes. "Unauthorized transfers between accounts, client statements that don't match the actual portfolio holdings, and investment decisions that make no sense given the client's risk profiles," David explained. "The CEO, Martin Walsh, has been making increasingly aggressive trades that seem designed to generate fees rather than returns." The pattern David described was disturbingly familiar. Walsh appeared to be using a more sophisticated version of Marcus's scheme, generating income through excessive trading while gradually depleting client accounts through unauthorized fees and commission. The crimes were harder to detect because they were spread across hundreds of small accounts, rather than concentrated in a few large portfolios. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "At least 2 years, possibly longer." "Walsh has been very careful to keep the losses small enough that individual clients don't notice, but the cumulative effect is devastating. I estimate that he's stolen over $2 million from retirement accounts, mostly belonging to teachers, nurses, and other public employees." The victims David described were exactly the kind of people who could least afford to lose their retirement savings. Teachers and nurses typically earned modest salaries throughout their careers, relying on careful investment planning to ensure financial security in their later years. Walsh's fraud was literally stealing their futures, and the thought of it made my blood boil. "Have you reported this to anyone?" I asked. David shook his head. "I'm just a part-time contractor with no official authority." Walsh could easily discredit me by claiming I'm a disgruntled former Pinnacle employee trying to create problems. "I need someone with credibility and resources to investigate this properly." I understood his dilemma perfectly. David's association with Pinnacle made him a problematic witness, regardless of his innocence in that scandal, but his analytical skills and attention to detail made him an ideal collaborator for building a case against Walsh. The key would be gathering independent evidence that could stand on its own merit. "I'll need to see documentation," I said. "Financial records, client statements, transaction logs, anything that shows a pattern of unauthorized activity." David smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. "I've been copying everything for the past 6 months. I learned from watching what you did at Pinnacle that documentation is everything." Over the next 3 weeks, David and I worked together to build a comprehensive case against Martin Walsh and Heritage Portfolio Management. The evidence was even more damning than David had initially suggested. Walsh had been systematically overcharging clients for services, investing their money in high-risk ventures that generated substantial commissions for his firm, and using a complex web of fees and penalties to disguise the theft. The most shocking discovery was that Walsh had been specifically targeting elderly clients with early-stage dementia, knowing that they would be unlikely to question discrepancies in their statements or challenge his investment decision. He'd developed relationships with several assisted living facilities, offering financial seminars that were actually recruitment events for potential victims. "This is elder abuse on an industrial scale," Patricia observed as we reviewed the evidence. "Walsh isn't just stealing money, he's preying on the most vulnerable members of society." We presented our findings to the Illinois Attorney General's office, which launched an immediate investigation into Heritage Portfolio Management. The scope of the fraud was staggering: over $5 million stolen from more than 300 clients, most of whom were retirees who had trusted Walsh with their life savings. Walsh's arrest made front-page news in the Chicago Tribune, with headlines describing him as the retirement thief and a predator in pinstripe. The investigation revealed that he'd used client funds to finance a lavish lifestyle that included a $2 million mansion, luxury cars, and expensive vacations. While his victims struggled to pay medical bills and housing costs, Walsh had been living like a millionaire on their stolen money. The trial was a media sensation, with dozens of elderly victims testifying about how Walsh's fraud had destroyed their financial security. Many had been forced to return to work in their 70s and 80s, taking minimum wage jobs to survive after losing their retirement savings. The human cost of Walsh's crimes was devastating, and the courtroom was often filled with tears as victims described the impact on their lives. David's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. His technical expertise and moral courage had made the investigation possible, and his detailed documentation provided the evidence needed to secure a conviction. The defense attempted to discredit him by referencing his association with Pinnacle, but David's integrity and professionalism were evident to everyone in the courtroom. Walsh was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and ordered to pay $8 million in restitution. The sentence was longer than Marcus had received, reflecting the sophisticated nature of his scheme and the vulnerability of his victims. The judge specifically noted that Walsh had violated the trust placed in him by society's most vulnerable members, making his crimes particularly heinous. The Heritage case established Crawford & Associates as the premier forensic accounting firm in the region. Our success in exposing two major fraud schemes had earned us recognition from federal regulators, law enforcement agencies, and industry organizations. We were invited to speak at conferences, consulted on legislative reforms, and retained by major corporations, seeking to strengthen their internal controls, but the real reward came from the letters we received from fraud victims, whose savings we'd helped recover. Elderly teachers who could afford their medications, retired nurses who could keep their homes, and countless families who'd been saved from financial ruin because we'd exposed the schemes that threatened their security. My journey from demoted assistant to forensic accounting partner had been unexpected and often painful, but it had led me to work that was genuinely meaningful. Every investigation was an opportunity to protect innocent people from financial predators, and every successful prosecution was a victory for justice and accountability. The Pinnacle scandal that had once seemed like the end of my career had actually been the beginning of something much more important. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually preparing us for the best things that are yet to come. And sometimes the skills we develop in surviving one crisis become exactly what we need to solve the next one. As I sat in my office late one evening, reviewing files for our next investigation, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me here. Richard Thornfield's decision to demote me had seemed like a personal catastrophe, but it had actually positioned me to expose a massive fraud and launch a career dedicated to protecting others from similar schemes. Justice, I'd learned, often arrives in unexpected ways, but when it finally comes, it's usually more complete and satisfying than anything we could have planned ourselves. 5 years after the Pinnacle financial scandal, I stood at the podium of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, addressing an audience of 300 financial executives, regulators, and law enforcement officials. The annual Financial Crimes Summit had become the premier conference for discussing fraud prevention, and I'd been invited as the keynote speaker to share insights from our most significant investigation. Ladies and gentlemen, financial fraud isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, I began, my voice carrying across the packed auditorium. It's about the retired teacher who has to choose between medication and groceries because her pension was stolen. It's about the young family whose college savings disappeared into a Ponzi scheme. Every case we investigate represents real people whose lives have been devastated by greed and deception. The audience listened intently as I outlined the evolution of financial fraud in the digital age. Crawford & Associates had investigated over 40 major cases since our founding, uncovering schemes ranging from cryptocurrency pump and dumps to sophisticated insider trading rings. Our success rate was unprecedented, with convictions secured in 97% of our cases and over $200 million in stolen funds recovered for victims. After my presentation, I was approached by Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Her expression was serious, suggesting that this wasn't a casual conversation about my speech. "Miss Martinez, we have a situation that requires your expertise," she said quietly. "There's a federal investigation underway that could benefit from your experience with family-controlled businesses and internal fraud." She handed me a business card with a phone number written on the back. "Can you be in Washington tomorrow morning?" This is extremely time-sensitive. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. I'd worked with federal agencies on numerous occasions, but a direct request from the FBI suggested something significant was unfolding. I agreed to the meeting, curious about what kind of case would require such immediate attention. The next morning, I found myself in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters, surrounded by agents, prosecutors, and federal regulators. The walls were covered with organizational charts, financial flow diagrams, and photographs that looked like a massive conspiracy investigation. "We're dealing with the largest financial fraud in U.S. history," Agent Torres began. "A network of investment firms, banks, and insurance companies that have been systematically stealing from client accounts for over a decade. The estimated losses exceed $2 billion, with victims spanning all 50 states. The scope of the investigation was breathtaking. The criminal organization had operated like a sophisticated business, with different firms handling recruitment, money laundering, and victim management. They'd targeted specific demographic groups, including military veterans, elderly retirees, and immigrant communities, who were less likely to report suspicious activity. The ringleader is someone you're familiar with," Agent Torres continued, clicking to a photograph that made my blood run cold. "Richard Thornfield." Richard's face stared back at me from the projection screen, but he looked different from the man I remembered. His hair was completely gray, his face was gaunt, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd spent years living in fear. He'd been released from federal prison 18 months earlier after serving his reduced sentence, and he'd apparently used his freedom to orchestrate the most ambitious fraud scheme in American history. After his release, Thornfield disappeared from public view, Agent Torres explained. "We now know he was recruiting former associates and building a network of shell companies designed to steal retirement funds from vulnerable populations. He's been using his knowledge of regulatory gaps and his connections in the financial industry to operate under the radar." The investigation revealed that Richard had learned from his son's mistakes. Instead of operating through a single company where fraud could be easily detected, he'd created a network of seemingly independent firms that shared information and resources. Each company appeared legitimate on the surface, with proper licensing and regulatory compliance, but they were all controlled by Richard through a complex web of offshore entities. "We need someone who understands how Thornfield thinks," Agent Torres said, looking directly at me. "You've seen his methods before, and you know how he operates. Your insights could be crucial to shutting down this network before they steal more money." I spent the next 6 weeks embedded with the FBI task force, analyzing financial records and helping agents understand the sophisticated fraud techniques that Richard's network was employing. The case was unlike anything I'd worked on before, requiring knowledge of international banking, cryptocurrency transactions, and complex corporate structures that spanned multiple jurisdictions. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Richard had made a crucial error in his operational security. He'd been communicating with his network through encrypted messaging apps, but he'd used a personal phone number that could be traced back to a safe house in the Cayman Islands. The phone records revealed the locations of his primary co-conspirators and the financial institutions they were using to launder stolen funds. The coordinated arrests took place on a Tuesday morning in October, with simultaneous raids in 12 cities across the United States and 4 international locations. Richard was captured at his Cayman Islands compound, along with computer servers containing detailed records of the entire criminal operation. The evidence was so comprehensive that most of his co-conspirators agreed to plea deals rather than face trial. The media coverage was extensive, with news outlets describing the case as the Thornfield Network and highlighting the irony that Richard had escalated from a small-time embezzlement scandal to organizing the largest financial fraud in American history. His mugshot appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the country, showing a man whose greed had ultimately consumed everything he'd once valued. During the investigation, I learned that Marcus had been released from federal prison 6 months earlier. Unlike his father, Marcus had apparently learned from his experience and was working as a delivery driver in Milwaukee, living quietly under an assumed name and trying to rebuild his life without attracting attention. The contrast between father and son was striking. One had used his freedom to commit even greater crimes, while the other was attempting to make amends for his past mistake. Richard's trial lasted 4 months and featured testimony from over 200 victims whose lives had been destroyed by his scheme. The evidence presented by prosecutors was overwhelming, including recorded phone conversations, where Richard discussed harvesting retirement accounts and maximizing extraction from vulnerable clients. His criminal network had operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, complete with training manuals, performance metrics, and quality control procedures. The judge's sentencing statement was particularly memorable. Ms. Thornfield, you have demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication and moral bankruptcy that is truly exceptional. Your crimes have caused immeasurable suffering to thousands of innocent people, many of whom trusted you with their life savings because of your family's reputation in the financial industry. You have betrayed not just your victims, but the very foundations of our economic system. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence ever imposed for financial fraud. The judge noted that his age and the scope of his crimes made it unlikely that he would ever be suitable for release and that his continued freedom would pose an unacceptable risk to public safety. The Thornfield Network case established new precedents for investigating international financial crimes and led to significant reforms in regulatory oversight. Congress passed legislation requiring enhanced reporting for offshore financial transactions, and federal agencies received increased funding for cybercrime investigation units. For me, the case represented the completion of a journey that had begun 5 years earlier in Richard's office. The man who had once humiliated me by demoting me to his son's assistant was now spending the rest of his life in federal prison, brought down by the very investigative skills that his actions had helped me develop. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. Richard's decision to demote me had been intended as an act of corporate cruelty, designed to force me out of the company while protecting his incompetent son. Instead, it had positioned me to witness Marcus's crimes firsthand, launching a career that would ultimately lead to Richard's own downfall. As I sat in my office one evening, reviewing the final reports from the Thornfield Network investigation, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. The humiliation I'd felt 5 years earlier had seemed like the end of my professional life, but it had actually been the beginning of something much more meaningful. I'd gone from managing investment portfolios to protecting innocent people from financial predators. I'd traded a corner office in a corrupt company for a career dedicated to justice and accountability. And I'd discovered that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually preparing us for the most important work we'll ever do. Saw the news about Richard's sentencing. Justice served. Drinks tonight to celebrate? I smiled, thinking about how our professional relationship had evolved into a lasting friendship forged by shared adversity. The Pinnacle scandal had scattered our team to different companies and different cities, but it had also created bonds that would last a lifetime. The universe, I'd learned, has a peculiar sense of justice. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up giving us exactly what we need to fulfill our true purpose. And sometimes the skills we develop in surviving one betrayal become the foundation for protecting others from similar harm. Richard Thornfield had thought he was ending my career when he demoted me to his son's assistant. Instead, he'd launched me on a path that would make me one of the most successful forensic accountants in the country, and ultimately lead to his own destruction. That's the thing about justice. It doesn't always arrive when we expect it, but when it finally comes, it's often more complete and satisfying than anything we could have imagined. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.